Ah, there you are. What got you? Where were we? Silas Marner by George Eliot. Chapter 7, maybe 8, we'll see. Yet the next moment, there seemed to be some evidence that ghosts had a more condescending disposition than Mr. Macy attributed to them. For the pale, thin figure of Silas Marner was suddenly seen standing in the warm light, uttering no word, but looking round at the company with his strange, unearthly eyes. The long pipes give a simultaneous movement, like the antennae of startled insects, and every man present, not excepting even the sceptical farrier, had an impression that he saw, not Silas Marner in the flesh, but an apparition. For the door by which Silas had entered was hidden by the high screened seats, and no one had noticed his approach. Mr. Macy, sitting a long way off the ghost, which might suppose to have felt an argumentative triumph, which would tend to neutralise his share of the general alarm. Had he not always said that when Silas Marner was in that strange trance of his soul went loose from his body? Here was the demonstration. Nevertheless, on the whole, he would have been as well contented without it. For a few moments there was a dead silence, Marner's want of breath and agitation not allowing him to speak. The landlord, under the habitual sense that he was bound to keep his house open to all company, and confident in the protection of his unbroken neutrality, at last took on himself the task of adjourning the ghost. "Master Marner," he said, in a conciliatory tone, "what's lacking to you? What's your business here?"
"Robbed," said Silas gaspingly. "I've been robbed. I want the constable and the justice and Squire Cass and Mr. Crackenthorpe."
"Lay hold on him, Jem Rodney," said the landlord, the idea of a ghost subsiding. "He's off his head, I doubt. He's wet through." Jem Rodney was the outermost man, and sat conveniently near Marner's standing place, but he declined to give his services. "Come lay hold on him yourself, Mr. Snell, if you've a mind," said Jem rather sullenly. "He's been robbed and murdered too, from what I know," he added in a muttering tone.
"Jem Rodney,"
said Silas, turning and fixing his strange eyes on the suspected man. "Ah, Mr. Marner, what do you want with me?" said Jem, trembling a little, and seizing his drinking can as a defensive weapon.
"If it was you who stole my money,"
said Silas, clasping his hands entreatingly and raising his voice to a cry,
"give it me back. I won't meddle with you. I won't set the constable on you. Give it me back, and I'll let you have a guinea." "Me stole your money?" said Jem angrily. "I'll pitch this can at your eye if you talk of my stealing your money."
Come, Master Marner," said the landlord, now rising resolutely and seizing Marner by the shoulder. "If you've got any information to lay, speak it out sensibly, and show us you're right in your mind. You're in your right mind, if you expect anybody to listen to you. You're as wet as a drowned rat. Sit down and dry yourself, and speak forward, man." "Ah, to be sure," said the farrier, who began to feel that he had not been quite on a par with himself and the occasion. "Let's have no more staring and screaming, else we'll have you strapped for a madman. That was why I didn't speak up first. Thinks I the man's run mad." Aye, make him sit down," said several voices at once, well pleased that the reality of ghosts remained still an open question. The landlord forced Marner to take off his coat, and then to sit down in a chair aloof from everyone else, in the centre of the circle, and in the direct rays of the fire. The weaver, too feeble to have any distinct purpose, beyond that of getting help to recover his money, submitted unresistingly. The transient fears of the company were now forgotten in their strong curiosity, and all faces were turned towards Silas, when the landlord, having seated himself again, said, "Now then, Master Marner, what's this you got to say, as you've been robbed? Speak out." I'll just have a little sip of water. Bear with me. I can't remember if I was doing any particular voices when I read the last few chapters. We'll see what happens, shall we? "He'd better not say again as it was me who robbed him," cried Jem Rodney hastily. "What could I have done with his money? I could as easily steal the parson's surplice and wear it." Hold your tongue, Jem, and let's hear what he has to say, said the landlord. Now then, Master Marner. Silas now told his story under frequent questioning, as the mysterious character of the robbery became evident. This strangely novel situation of opening his trouble to his Raveloe neighbours, of sitting in the warmth of a hearth not his own, and feeling the presence of faces and voices which were his nearest promise of help, had doubtless its influence on Marner, in spite of his passionate preoccupation with his loss. Our consciousness rarely registers the beginning of a growth within us any more than without us. There have been many circulations of the sap before we detect the smallest sign of the bud. The slight suspicion with which his hearers at first listened to him gradually melted away before the convincing simplicity of his distress. It was impossible for his neighbours to doubt that Marner was telling the truth, not because they were capable of arguing at once from the nature of his statements to the absence of any motive for making them falsely, but because, as Mr. Macy observed, folks as had the devil to back 'em were not likely to be so mushed as poor Silas was. Rather, from the strange fact that the robber had left no traces, and had happened to know the nick of time, utterly incalculable by mortal agents, when Silas would go away from home without locking his door, the more probable conclusion seemed to be that his disreputable intimacy in that quarter, if it ever existed, had been broken up, and that, in consequence, this ill turn had been done to Marner by somebody it was quite in vain to set the constable after. Why this preternatural of Helen should be obliged to wait till the door was unlocked was a question which did not present itself. "It isn't Jem Rodney as has done this work, Master Marner," said the landlord. "You mustn't be casting your eye at poor Jem. There might be a bit of reckoning against Jem for the matter of a hair or so, if anybody was bound to keep their eyes staring open and never to wink. But Jem's been a-sitting here drinking his can like the decentest man in... something. I can't read that because it's blanked out on the page. I wonder why. Something, a location, I suppose, before you left your house, Mr. Marner, by something account. I'll have to look that up. Maybe I'll put that in the comments or something. Aye, said Mr. Macy. Let's have no accusing of the innocent. That isn't the law. There must be folks to swear again a man before he can be ta'en up. Let's have no accusing of the innocent, Mr. Marner. Memory was not so utterly torpid in Silas that it could not be awakened by these words. With a movement of compunction as new and strange to him as anything else within the last hour, he started from his chair and went close up to Jem, looking at him as if he wanted to assure himself of the expression in his face. "I was wrong," he said. Yes. I ought to have thought. There's nothing to witness against you, Jem. Only you've been to my house oftener than anybody else, and so you came into my head. I don't accuse you. I won't accuse anybody. Only, he added, lifting up his hands to his head and turning away with bewildered misery, I try to think where my money can be. Aye, they're gone, and when they're gone where it's hot enough to melt them, I doubt, said Mr. Macy. Tch, said the farrier. Tch, said the farrier. And then he asked with a cross-examining air, how much money might there be in the bags, Mr. Marner? £272, 12 and sixpence, last night when I counted it, said Silas, seating himself again with a groan. Pooh, why, there be none so heavy to carry. Some tramp's been in, that's all, and as for the no footmarks and the bricks and sand being all right, well, your eyes are pretty much like an insect's, Mr. Marner. They're obliged to look so close, you can't see much at a time. It's my opinion. If I'd been you, or if you'd been me, for it comes to the same thing, you wouldn't have thought you'd found anything as you left it. But what I vote is, as two of the sensiblest of the company should go with you to Master Kench, the constable's. He's ill in bed, I know that much, and get him to appoint one of us as deputy, for that's the law, and I don't think anybody will take upon him to contradict me there. It isn't much of a walk to Kench's, and then, if it's me as deputy, I'll go back with you, Master Marner, and examine your premises. And if anybody's got any fault to find with that, I'll thank him to stand up and say it out like a man." By this pregnant speech, the farrier had re-established his self-complacency, and waited with confidence to hear himself named as one of the superlatively sensible men. "Let us see how the night is, though," said the landlord, who also considered himself personally concerned in this preposition. "Why, it rains heavy still," he said, returning from the door. "Well, I'm not the man to be afraid of the rain," said the farrier, "for it'll look bad when Justice Mallam hears respectable men like us had information laid before him and took no steps." The landlord agreed with this view, and after taking the sense of the company and duly rehearsing a small ceremony known in high ecclesiastical life as the nolo episcopari, he consented to take on himself the chill dignity of going to Kench's. But to the farrier's strong disgust, Mr. Macy now started an objection to his proposing himself as deputy constable, for that oracular old gentleman, claiming to know the law, stated as a fact delivered to him by his father that no doctor could be a constable. "And you're a doctor, I reckon, though you're only a cow doctor, for a fly's a fly, though it may be a horsefly," concluded Mr. Macy, wondering a little at his own cuteness. There was a hot debate upon this, the farrier being, of course, indisposed to renounce the quality of the doctor, but contending that a doctor could be a constable if he liked. The law meant he needn't be one if he didn't like. Mr. Macy thought this was nonsense, since the law was not likely to be fonder of doctors than of other folks. Moreover, if it was the nature of doctors more than of other men not to like being constables, how come Mr. Dowlas be so eager to act in that capacity? "I don't want to act the constable," said the farrier, driven into a corner by this merciless reasoning, "and there's no man can say it of me, if you tell the truth. But if there's to be any jealousy and envying about going to Kench's in the rain, let them go as they like it. You won't get me to go, I can tell you." But the landlord's intervention, however, the dispute was accommodated. Mr. Dallas consented to go as a second person, disinclined to act officially, and so poor Silas, furnished with some old coverings, turned out his two companions into the rain again, thinking of the long night hours before him, not as those who long to rest, but as those who expect to watch for the morning. End of chapter. I think I'm going to just close the window before I read the next chapter. It's decent, right? I'll be back in a moment. That's better. Right, next chapter, chapter 8. When Godfrey Cass returned from Mrs. Osgood's party at midnight, he was not much surprised to learn that Dunsey had not come home. Perhaps he had not told Wildfire and was waiting for another chance. Perhaps, on that foggy afternoon, he had preferred housing himself at the Red Lion at Batherley for the night, if the run had kept him in the neighbourhood, for he was not likely to feel much concern about leaving his brother in suspense. Godfrey's mind was too full of Nancy Lammeter's looks and behaviour, too full of the exasperation against himself and his lot, which the sight of her always produced in him, for him to give much thought to Wildfire or the probabilities of Dunstan's conduct. The next morning, the whole village was excited by the story of the robbery, and Godfrey, like everyone else, was occupied in gathering and discussing news about it, and in visiting the stone pits. The rain had washed away all possibility of distinguishing footmarks, but a close investigation of the spot had disclosed, in the direction opposite to the village, a tinderbox with a flint and steel half sunk in the mud. It was not Silas's tinderbox, for the only one he had ever had was still standing on his shelf, and the inference generally accepted was that the tinderbox in the ditch was somehow connected with the robbery. A small minority shook their heads and intimated that opinion that it was not a robbery to have much light thrown on it by tinderboxes, that Master Marner's tale had a queer look with it, and that such things had been known as a man's doing himself a mischief, and then setting the justice to look for the doer. But when questioned closely as to their grounds for that opinion, and what Master Marner had to gain by such false pretences, they only shook their heads as before, and observed that there was no knowing what some folks counted gain. Moreover, that anybody had a right to their own opinions, grounds or no grounds, and that the weaver, as everybody knew, was partly crazy. Mr. Macy, though he joined in the defence of Marner against all suspicions of deceit and pooh-poohed the tinderbox, indeed repudiated it as a rather impious suggestion, tending to imply that everything must be done by human hands, and that there was no power which could make away with guineas without moving the bricks. Nevertheless, he turned round rather sharply on Mr. Tukey, when the zealous deputy, feeling that this was a view of the case peculiarly suited to a parish clerk, carried it still further, and doubted whether it was right to inquire into a robbery at all when the circumstances were so mysterious. As if, concluded Mr. Tukey, as if there was nothing but what could be made out by justices and constables. Now, don't you be for overshooting the mark, Tukey, said Mr. Macy, nodding his head aside admonishingly. That's what you're allays at. If I throw a stone and hit, you think there's somewhat better than hitting, and you try to throw a stone beyond. What I said was against the tinderbox. I said nothing against justices and constables, for they are King George's making, and it would be unbecoming a man in a parish office to fly out against King George. While these discussions were going on among the group outside the Rainbow, a higher consultation was being carried out within, under the presidency of Mr. Crackenthorpe, the rector, assisted by Squire Cass and other substantial parishioners. It had just occurred to Mr. Snell, the landlord, he being, as he observed, a man accustomed to put two and two together, to connect with the tinderbox, which, as deputy constable, he himself had had the honourable distinction of finding certain recollections of a pedlar who had called to drink at the house about a month before, and had actually stated that he carried a tinderbox about him with which to light his pipe. Here surely was a clue to be followed out. And as memory, when duly impregnated with ascertained facts, is sometimes surprisingly fertile, Mr. Snell gradually recovered a vivid imagination of the effect produced on him by the pedlar's countenance and conversation. He had a look in his eye which fell unpleasantly on Mr. Snell's sensitive organism. To be sure, he didn't say anything particular, no, except that about the tinderbox, but it isn't what a man says, it's the way he says it. Moreover, he had a swarthy foreignness of complexion which boded little honesty. Did he wear earrings? Mr. Crackenthorpe wanted to know, having some acquaintance with foreign customs. Well, stay, let me see, said Mr. Snell, like a docile clairvoyant who would really not make a mistake if she could help it. After stretching the corner of his mouth and contracting his eyes, as if he were trying to see the earrings, he appeared to give up the effort and said, well, he'd got earrings in his box to sell, so it's natural to suppose he might wear them. But he called at every house almost in the village. There's somebody else mayhap saw him in his ears, though I can't take upon me rightly to say. Mr. Snell was correct in his surmise, for somebody else would remember the pedlar's earrings. For on the spread of inquiry among the villagers, it was stated with gathering emphasis that the parson had wanted to know whether the pedlar wore earrings in his ears, and an impression was created that a great deal depended on the eliciting of this fact. Of course, everyone who heard the question, not having any distinct image of the pedlar as without earrings, immediately had an image of him with earrings. Larger or smaller, as the case might be, as the image was presently taken for a vivid recollection, so that the glazier's wife, a well-intentioned woman, not given to lying, and whose house was among the cleanest in the village, was ready to declare, as sure as ever she meant to take the sacrament, that this very next Christmas that ever was coming, that she had seen big earrings in the shape of the young moon in the pedlar's 2 ears, while Ginny Oates, the cobbler's daughter, being a more imaginative person, stated not only that she had seen them too, but they had made her blood creep, as it did at that very moment while she stood there. Also, by way of throwing further light on this clue of the tinderbox, a collection was made of the articles purchased from the pedlar at various houses and carried to the Rainbow to be exhibited there. In fact, there was a general feeling in the village that for the clearing up of this robbery there must be a great deal done at the Rainbow, and that no man need offer his wife an excuse for going there while it was the scene of several public duties. Some disappointment was felt, and perhaps a little indignation also, when it became known that Silas Marner, on being questioned by the squire and the parson, had retained no other recollection of the pedlar than he had called at his door, but had not entered his house, having turned away at once when Silas, holding the door ajar, said that he wanted nothing. This had been Silas's testimony, though he clutched strongly at the idea of the pedlar's being the culprit, if only because it gave him a definite image of a whereabout for his gold, after it had been taken away from its hiding place. He could see it now in the pedlar's box, but it was observed with some irritation in the village that anybody but a blind creature, like Marner, would have seen the man prowling about, for how he came to leave his tinderbox in the ditch close by if he hadn't been lingering there. Doubtless he had made his observations when he saw Marner at the door. Anybody might know, and only look at him, that the weaver was a half-crazy miser. It was a wonder the pedlar hadn't murdered him. Men of that sort, with rings in their ears, had been known for murderers often and often. There had been one tried at the Sizes not so long ago. But what there were people living who remembered it. Another little sip, I think. Foreigners, eh? Men wearing earrings? Swarthiness? Imagine that. Geoffrey Cass, indeed, entering the Rainbow during one of Mr. Snell's frequently repeated recitals of his testimony, had treated it lightly, stating that he himself had bought a penknife of the pedlar, and thought him a merry, grinning fellow enough. It was all nonsense, he said, about the man's evil looks, but this was spoken of in the village as the random talk of youth, as if it was only Mr. Snell who had seen something odd about the pedlar. On the contrary, there were at least half a dozen who were ready to go before Justice Mallam, and give in much more striking testimony than any the landlord could furnish. It was to be hoped Mr. Godfrey would not go to Tarley and throw cold water on what Mr. Snell had said there, and so prevent the justice from drawing up a warrant. He was suspected of intending this when, after midday, he was seen setting off on horseback in the direction of Tarley. But by this time Godfrey's interest in the robbery had faded before his growing anxiety about Dunstan and Wildfire, and he was going, not to Tarley, but to Batherley, unable to rest in uncertainty about them any longer. The possibility that Dunstan had been playing him the ugly trick of riding away with Wildfire to return at the end of the month, when he had gambled away or otherwise squandered the price of the horse, was a fear that urged itself upon him more, even the thought of an accidental injury. And now that the dance at Mrs. Osgood's was past, he was irritated with himself that he had trusted his horse to Dunstan. Instead of trying to still his fears, he encouraged them, with that superstitious impression which clings to us all, that if we expect evil very strongly, it is the less likely to come. And when he heard a horse approaching at a trot, he saw a hat rising above the hedge beyond an angle of the lane, he felt as if his conjuration had succeeded. But no sooner did the horse come within sight than his heart sank again. It was not Wildfire, and in a few moments more he discerned that the rider was not Dunstan, but Bryce, who pulled up to speak with a face that implied something disagreeable. "Well, Mr. Godfrey, that's a lucky brother of yours, that Master Dunsey, isn't he?" What do you mean?" said Godfrey hastily. "Why, hasn't he been home yet?" said Bryce. "Home? No. What's happened? Be quick. What has he done with my horse?" I thought it was yours, though he pretended you had parted with it to him." "Has he thrown him down and broken his knees?" said Godfrey, flushed with exasperation. "Oh, worse than that," said Bryce. "You see, I had made a bargain with him to buy the horse for 120, a swinging price, but I'd always liked the horse. And what does he do but go and stake him, fly at a hedge with stakes in it, atop of a bank with a ditch before it. The horse had been dead pretty good when he was found, so he hasn't been home since, has he?" "Home? No," said Godfrey, "and he'd better keep away. Confound me for a fool. I might have known this would be the end of it." "Well, to tell you the truth," said Bryce, "after I'd bargained for the horse, it did come into my head that he might be riding and selling the horse without your knowledge, for I didn't believe it was his own. I knew Master Dauncey was up to his tricks sometimes. But where can he be gone? He's never been seen at Batherley. He couldn't have been hurt, for he must have walked off." "Hurt?" said Godfrey bitterly. "He'll never be hurt. He's made to hurt other people." "And so you did give him leave to sell the horse, eh?" said Bryce. "Yes, I wanted to part with the horse. He was always a little too hard in the mouth for me," said Godfrey, his pride making him wince under the idea that Bryce had guessed the sale to be a matter of necessity. "I was going to see after him. I thought some mischief had happened. I'll go back now," he added, turning the horse's head and wishing he could get rid of Bryce, for he felt that the long-dreaded crisis in his life was close upon him. "You're coming on to Raveloe, aren't you?" "Well, no, not now," said Bryce. "I was coming round there, for I had to go to Flitton, and thought I might as well take you in my way, and just let you know all I knew myself about the horse. I suppose Master Dauncey didn't like to show himself till the ill news had blown over a bit. He's perhaps gone to pay a visit at the Three Crowns by Whitbridge. I know he's fond of the house." "Perhaps he is," said Godfrey rather absently. Then rousing himself, and he said with an effort at carelessness, "We shall hear of him soon enough, I'll be bound." "Well, here's my turning," said Bryce, not surprised to perceive that Godfrey was rather down. "So I'll bid you good day, and wish I may bring you better news another time." Godfrey rode along slowly, representing to himself the scene of confession to his father, from which he felt that there was now no longer any escape. The revelation about the money must be made the very next morning, and if he withheld the rest, Dunstan would be sure to come back shortly, and finding that he must bear the brunt of his father's anger, would tell the whole story out of spite, even though he had nothing to gain by it. There was one step, perhaps, by which he might still win Dunstan's silence and put off the evil day. He might tell his father that he had himself spent the money paid to him by Fowler, and as he had never been guilty of such an offence before, the affair would blow over after a little storming. But Godfrey could not bend himself to this. He felt that in letting Dunstan have the money, he had already been guilty of a breach of trust hardly less culpable than that of spending the money directly for his own behoof, and yet there was a distinction between the two acts which made him feel that the one was so much more blackening than the other as to be intolerable to him. "I don't pretend to be a good fellow," he said to himself, "but I'm not a scoundrel, at least. I'll stop short somewhere. I'll bear the consequences of what I have done sooner than make believe I've done what I never would have done. I never have spent the money for my own pleasure. I was tortured into it." Through the remainder of this day, Godfrey, with only occasional fluctuations, kept his will bent in the direction of a complete avowal to his father, and he withheld the story of Wildfire's loss till the next morning, that it might serve him as an introduction to heavier matter. The old squire was accustomed to his son's frequent absence from home, and thought neither Dunstan's nor Wildfire's non-appearance a matter of calling for remark. Godfrey said to himself again and again that if he let slip this one opportunity of confession, he might never have another. The revelation might be made even in a more odious way than by Dunstan's malignity. She might come, as she had threatened to do. And then he tried to make the scene easier to himself by rehearsal. He made up his mind how he would pass from the admission of his weakness in letting Dunstan have the money to the fact that Dunstan had a hold on him, which he had been unable to shake off, and how he would work up his father to expect something very bad before he told him the fact. The old squire was an implacable man. He made resolutions in violent anger, but he was not to be moved from them after his anger had subsided. As fiery volcanic matters cool and harden into rock. Like many violent and implacable men, he allowed evils to grow under favour of his own heedlessness, till they pressed upon him with exasperating force, and then he turned round with fierce severity and became unrelentingly hard. This was his system with his tenants. He allowed them to get into arrears, neglect their fences, reduce their stock, sell their straw, and otherwise go the wrong way, and then, when he became short of money in consequence of this indulgence, he took the hardest measures and would listen to no appeal. Godfrey knew all this, and felt it with the greater force because he had constantly suffered annoyance from witnessing his father's sudden fits of unrelentingness, for which his own habitual irresolution deprived him of all sympathy. He was not critical of the faulty indulgence which preceded these fits. That seemed to him natural enough. Still, there was the chance Godfrey thought, that his father's pride might see this marriage in a light that would induce him to hush it up, rather than turn his son out and make the family the talk of the country for 10 miles around. Another little sip, I think. Delicious. Water. This was the view of the case that Godfrey managed to keep before him pretty closely till midnight, and he went to sleep thinking that he had done with inward debating. He had done with inward debating. But when he awoke in the still morning darkness, he found it impossible to reawaken his evening thoughts. It was as if they had been tired out and were not to be aroused to further work. Instead of arguments for confession, he could now feel the presence of nothing but its evil consequences, the old dread of disgrace coming back, the old shrinking from the thought of raising a hopeless barrier between himself and Nancy, the old disposition to rely on chances which might be favourable to him and save him from betrayal. Why, after all, should he cut off the hope of them by his own act? He had seen the matter in a wrong light yesterday. He had been in a rage with Dunstan, and had thought of nothing but a thorough break-up of their mutual understanding. But what it would be really wisest for him to do was to try to soften his father's anger against Dunsey, and keep things as nearly as possible in their old condition. If Dunsey did not come back for a few days, and Godfrey did not know, but the rascal had enough money in his pocket to enable him to keep away still longer, everything might blow over. End of chapter 8. Shall I have the next one as well? Chapter 9? Yeah, let's have chapter 9 as well. Godfrey rose and took his own breakfast earlier than usual, but lingering in the waistcoated parlour till his younger brothers had finished their meal and gone out, awaiting his father, who always went out and had a walk with his managing man before breakfast. Everyone breakfasted at a different hour in the Red House, and the squire was always the latest, giving a long chance to a rather feeble morning appetite before he tried it. The table had been spread with substantial eatables nearly 2 hours before he presented himself, a tall, stout man of 60, with a face in which the knit brow and rather hard glance seemed contradicted by the slack and feeble mouth. Like that, I guess. His parson showed marks of habitual neglect. His dress was slovenly, and there was something in the presence of the old squire distinguishable from that of the ordinary farmers in the parish, who were perhaps every whit as refined as he, but having slouched their way through life with a consciousness of being in the vicinity of their betters, in inverted commas, wanted that self-possession and authoritativeness of voice and carriage which belonged to a man who thought of superiors as remote existences, with whom he had personally little more to do than with America or the stars. The squire had been used to parish homage all his life, used to the presupposition that his family, his tankards, and everything that was his were the oldest and best, and as he never associated with any gentry higher than himself, his opinion was not disturbed by comparison. He glanced at his son as he entered the room and said, "What, sir, haven't you had your breakfast yet?" But there was no pleasant morning greeting between them, not because of any unfriendliness, but because the sweet flower of courtesy is not a growth of such homes in the Red House. "Yes, sir," said Godfrey. "I've had my breakfast, but I was waiting to speak to you." "Ah, well," said the squire, throwing himself indifferently into his chair, and speaking in a ponderous coughing fashion, which was felt in Raveloe to be a sort of privilege of his rank, while he cut a piece of beef and held it up before the deerhound that had come in with him. "Ring the bell for my ale, will you?" How do I do ponderous coughing? Ring the bell for my ale, will you? Oh, that's not good for my throat. You youngsters' business is your own pleasure, mostly. There's no hurry about it for anybody but yourselves. I can't do that. The squire's life was quite as idle as his son's, but it was a fiction kept up by himself and his contemporaries in Raveloe that youth was exclusively the period of folly, and that their aged wisdom was constantly in a state of endurance mitigated by sarcasm. Godfrey waited before he spoke again until the ale had been brought and the door closed, an interval during which Fleet, the deerhound, had consumed enough bits of beef to make a poor man's holiday dinner.
"There's been a cursed piece of ill luck with Wildfire," he began. "Happened the day before yesterday." "What? Broke his knees?" said the squire, after taking a draught of ale. "I thought you knew how to ride better than that, sir. I never threw a horse down in my life. If I had, I might have whistled for another, for my father wasn't quite so ready to unstring as some other fathers I know of. But they must turn over a new leaf, they must. What with mortgages and arrears, I'm as short of cash as a roadside pauper. And that fool Kimball says the newspaper's talking about peace. Aye, the country wouldn't have a leg to stand on. Prices would run down like a jack and never get my arrears, not if I sold all my fellows up. And there's that damned Fowler. I won't put up with him any longer. I have to Winthrop to go to Cox this very day. The lying scoundrel told me he'd be sure to pay me 100 last month. He takes advantage because he's on that outlying farm, and I think I shall forget him." The squire, having delivered this speech in a coughing and interrupted manner, but with no pause long enough for the Godfrey to make it a pretext for taking up the word again, he felt that his father meant to ward off any request for money on the grounds of the misfortune with Wildfire, and that the emphasis he had thus been led to lay on his shortness of cash and arrears was likely to produce an attitude of mind the utmost unfavourable for his own disclosure. But he must go on, now he had begun. "It's worse than breaking the horse's knees. He's been staked and killed," he said, as soon as his father was silent and had begun to cut his meat. "But I wasn't thinking of asking you to buy me another horse. I was only thinking I had lost the means of paying you with the price of Wildfire, as I had meant to do. Dunsey took him to the hunt to sell him for me the other day, and after he'd made a bargain for 120 with Bryce, he went after the hounds and took some fool's leap or other that did for the horse at once. If it hadn't been for that, I should have paid you £100 this morning." The squire had laid down his knife and fork, and was staring at his son in amazement, not being sufficiently quick of brain to form a probable guess as to what could have caused so strange an inversion of the paternal and filial relations in this proposition of his son to pay him £100. "Truth is, sir, I'm very sorry. I was quite to blame," said Godfrey. "Fowler did pay that £100. He paid it to me when I was over there one day last month, and Dunsey bothered me for the money, and I let him have it, because I hoped I should be able to pay it you before this." The squire was purple with anger before his son had done speaking, and found utterance difficult. "You let Dunsey have it, sir? And how long have you been so thick with Dunsey that you must collogue with him to embezzle my money? Are you turning into a scamp? I tell you, I will not have it. I'll turn the whole pack of you out of this house together and marry again. I'd have you remember, sir, my property's got to entail on it. Like my grandfather's time, the Casses can do as they like with their land. Remember that, sir. Let Dunsey have the money. Why should you let Dunsey have the money? There's some lie at the bottom of it." "Oh, there's no lie, sir," said Godfrey. "I wouldn't have spent the money myself, but Dunsey bothered me, and I was a fool in letting him have it. But I meant to pay it, whether he did or not. That's the whole story. I never meant to embezzle money, and I'm not the man to do it. You never know, you may do a dishonest trick, sir." "Well, where's Dunsey, then? What do you stand there for? Go and fetch Dunsey, as I tell you, and let him give account of what he wanted the money for and what he's done with it. He'll repent it. I'll turn him out. I said I would, and I'll do it. He shan't brave me. Go and fetch him."
"Dunsey isn't come back, sir."
"What? Did he break his own neck, then?" said the squire, with some disgust at the idea that, in that case, he could not fulfil his threat. "No, he wasn't hurt, I believe, for the horse was found dead, and Dunsey must have walked off. I dare say we shall see him again by and by. I don't know where he is." "And what you must be letting him have my money for? Answer me that," said the squire, attacking Godfrey again, since Dunsey was not within reach.
"Well, sir, I don't know," said Godfrey, hesitatingly. That was a feeble evasion, but Godfrey was not fond of lying, and not being sufficiently aware that no sort of duplicity can long flourish without the help of vocal falsehoods, he was quite unprepared with inventive motives. "You don't know? I'll tell you what it is, sir. You've been up to some trick, and you've been bribing him not to tell," said the squire, with a sudden acuteness which startled Godfrey, who felt his heart beat violently at the nearness of his father's guess. The sudden alarm pushed him to take the next step, A very slight impulse suffices for that on a downward road. "Why, sir," he said, trying to speak with careless ease, "it was a little affair between me and Dunsey. It's no matter to anybody else. It's hardly worthwhile to pry into young men's fooleries. It wouldn't have made any difference to you, sir, if I had not had the bad luck to lose Wildfire. I should have paid you the money."
"Fooleries? Pshaw! It's time you'd done with fooleries, and I'd have you know, sir, you must ha' done with them," said the squire, frowning and casting an angry glance at his son. "Your goings-on are not what I shall find money for any longer, as my grandfather had his stable full of horses, and kept a good house too, and in worse times, but what I can make out, and so might I, if I hadn't 4 good-for-nothing fellows to hang on me like horse-leeches. I've been too good a father to you all, that's what it is, but I shall pull up, sir."
Godfrey was silent. He was not likely to be very penetrating in his judgments, but he had always had a sense of his father's indulgence had not been kindness, and had had a vague longing for some discipline that would have checked his own errant weakness and helped his better will. The squire ate his bread and meat hastily, took a deep draught of ale, and then turned his chair from the table and began to speak again.
"It'll be all the worse for you, you know. You need try and help me keep other things together. You need try and help me keep things together."
"Well, sir, I've often offered to take the management of things, but you know I've always taken it ill. You've always taken it ill always, and seemed to think I wanted to push you out of your place."
"I know nothing of your offering or my taking it ill," said the squire, whose memory consisted in certain strong impressions, unmodified by detail. "But I know one while you seemed to be thinking of marrying, and I didn't offer to put any obstacles in your way, as some fathers would. As I'd leave you married Lamister's daughter as anybody, I suppose. If I said you'd say nay, you'd have kept on with it, but for want of contradiction you changed your mind. You're a shilly-shally fellow. You take after your poor mother. She never had a will of her own. A woman had no call for one if she's got a proper man for a husband. But your wife had need have one, for you'd hardly know your own mind enough to make both your legs walk one way. The lass hasn't said downright she won't have you, has she?"
"No," said Godfrey, feeling hot and uncomfortable, "but I don't think she will."
"Think! Why haven't you had the courage to ask her? Do you stick to it? You want to have her, that's the thing."
"There's no other woman I want to marry," said Godfrey evasively.
"Well then, let me make the offer for you. That's all. If you haven't plotted it yourself. Lavender isn't likely to loathe for his daughter to marry into my family, I should think. And as for the pretty lass, she wouldn't have the cousin, and there's nobody else, as I see, could ha' stood in your way."
"I'd rather let it be, please, sir, at present," said Godfrey in alarm. "I think she's a little offended with me now, and I should not like to speak for myself. A man must manage things for himself."
"Well, speak then, and manage it, and see if you can turn over a new leaf. That's what a man must do when he thinks of marrying."
"I don't see how I can think of it at present, sir. You wouldn't like to settle me on one of the farms, I suppose, and I don't think she'd come to live in this house with all my brothers. It's a different sort of life to what she's used to."
"Not come to live in this house? Don't tell me. You ask her, that's all," said the squire with a short, scornful laugh.
"I'd rather let the thing be at present, sir," said Godfrey. "I hope you won't try to hurry it on by saying anything."
"I shall do what I choose," said the squire, "and shall let you know I'm master, else you may turn and find an estate to drop into somewhere else. Go out and tell Winthrop not to go to Cox's, but wait for me, and tell him to get my horse saddled. And stop, look out and get that hack of Dunce's sold, and hand me my money, will you? He'll keep no more hacks at my expense, and if you know where he's sneaking, I dare say you do, you may tell him to spare himself the journey of coming back home. Let him turn ostler and keep himself, if shan't hang on any more."
Let's have another little sip. Nearly done at the end of the chapter. Nearly done with my water as well. "I don't know where he is, sir, and if I did, it isn't my place to tell him to keep away," said Godfrey, moving towards the door.
"Confound it, sir, don't stay arguing, but go and order thy horse," said the squire, taking up a pipe.
Godfrey left the room, hardly knowing whether it were more relieved by the sense that the interview was ended without having made any change in his position, or more uneasy that he had entangled himself still further in prevarication and deceit. What had passed about his proposing to Nancy had raised a new alarm, lest by some after-dinner words of his father's to Mr. Lammeter should be thrown into the embarrassment of being obliged absolutely to decline her when she seemed to be within easy reach. He fled to his usual refuge, that of hoping for some unforeseen turn of fortune, some favourable chance which would save him from unpleasant consequences, perhaps even justify his inscrutiny by manifesting its prudence. And in this point of trusting to some throw of fortune's dice, Godfrey can hardly be called specially old-fashioned. Favourable chance, I fancy, is the god of all men who follow their own devices instead of obeying a law they believe in. Let even a polished man of these days get into a position he is ashamed to avow, and his mind will be bent on all the possible issues that may deliver him from the calculable results of that position. Let him live outside his income, or shirk the resolute honest work that brings wages, and he will presently find himself dreaming of a possible benefactor, a possible simpleton who may be cajoled into using his interest, a possible state of mind in some possible person not yet forthcoming. Let him neglect the responsibilities of his office, and he will inevitably anchor himself on the chance that the thing left undone may turn out not to be of the supposed importance. Let him betray his friend's confidence, and he will adore that some cunningly complexity called chance, which gives him the hope that his friend will never know. Let him forsake a decent craft, that he may pursue the gentilities of profession to which nature never called him, and his religion will infallibly be the worship of blessed chance, which he will believe in as the mighty creator of success. The evil principle deprecated in that religion is the orderly sequence by which the seed brings forth a crop after its kind. End of chapter. We're getting through this. We're not far from halfway. So, what's that? 9 chapters done, and we're not far off halfway. I'm quite enjoying this. I'm quite enjoying it. It's quite funny. I like that. It's good stuff. All right, I'll do another few chapters soon. Look forward to that. See you next time. Cheerio, bye.